broadcasted live via YouTube, so we have to start on time. Otherwise people feel a bit lost in front of their screens. We've got the great pleasure to welcome Philippe Sons. I'm not sure if we need to introduce him. He's extremely well known. He's a Franco-British lawyer. He's got a direct bond with Izieu because the mother of Philippe was the childhood friend of a lady who's very dear to us all here, Hélène Vivianson, and who was one of the children of Izieu. She spent a couple of weeks in Izieu. She's here, Hélène, she's amongst us. I'll immediately stand the floor to Philippe. He's going to talk to us based on what he wrote in his book East West Street. That was the name of the title of his book. Talk about the famous concept of crime against humanity and genocide, which we tend to mix up here, or we see it as being complementary. In his book, he demonstrated that we're talking about two concepts that are radically different and sometimes even totally opposed. Thank you very much, Dominique, and welcome to you all. I'm really honored and very happy to be back here for the second time to Izieu, to this Izieu home, this Izieu Center. It's very touching to be here. I think you've all got the same reaction and the same feeling when you're here. Dominic has asked me to talk about this book which I wrote 5 years ago, which has been translated in about 30 languages. East West Street, Nuremberg in French. There's a second book called The Rap Line, and in French it's called La Filière. And you've probably heard about the podcast En France Culture, the French national radio. I'm an international professor of law at the University of London. I'm a lawyer, and I plead in many international cases, and that's been the case for about 30 years now. I've also been involved in international cases, pleaded in front of the International Court of Justice within the Vukovar case. I'm also a counsellor for Gambia against Myanmar, and that's within the Ayanya case, also in other tribunals and courts, national courts, for example the Pinochet case. And that was a case that was in 1998. In 2010 I was in this situation. I was doing my work at the university, and I was talking about international courts and tribunals, and I received in April 2010 an invitation to give a conference in a city I hadn't been to before, and that was Lviv, which is in Ukraine. Now, they said, are you willing to come and see us and give us a conference on the court cases you participated to that relate to crime against humanity and genocide? And I said yes. It's not because I wanted to give a speech, give a conference. It's because my grandfather was born in Lviv when the city's name was Nuremberg. That was up to 1919. It was called Nuremberg, then became Wuf, and afterwards it became Vof, and then Viv, and Neapolis. It's exactly the same place, it's the same city, an amazing city, by the way. I accepted their invitation because I wanted to see the home, the house where my grandfather was born. So I went to Viv, and this conference I'd prepared for the University of London, and I found the house of my grandfather, but I discovered other things as well. I actually discovered that the person who created the concept of crime against humanity within this the bylaws, Herr Stadtmann, within the Nuremberg professor at the University of Cambridge in 1945. In fact, he was born in Hamburg, and he studied law between 1915 and 1990. The Faculty of Law at the University of Nuremberg, who'd invited me, and I thought that was quite amazing, really. And I was arriving there at the University of Viv, and I would be announcing the fact that the origins of crime against humanity are in this very city, in this very Faculty of Law. A couple of weeks later, summer 2010, I discovered a second coincidence quite remarkable. The man who invented the word genocide, Raphael Lembing, he as well had been a student in the same Faculty of Law between 1921 and 1926. And when I arrived there at that city, Lviv, in October 2010 at the Faculty of Law, the professors and students are amazed to see that the origins of these two crimes actually start in their very Faculty of Law of their university. And I thought, what actually happened in Nuremberg during that period that led to these ideas that in 1945 became crime against humanity and genocide? I just started writing a book on the life of my grandfather, of Crush Gatham and Raphael Enck. Then a fourth person arrived, Hans Frank. He was a lawyer, personal advisor of Adolf Hitler between 1928 and 1933. He came Ministry of Justice in the Baviera Länder in 1933 and 1939. He was the general governor of Poland occupied by Germany. And he is a jurist as well. Hans Frank arrived in the city of Viv, which was called Nuremberg at the time. That was the 1st of August 1942, and he gave a conference. He actually announced at that time the application and enforcement of the final solution in District Galicia and in the city of Nuremberg. And in the coming weeks and months, more than 500,000 individuals were exterminated. Now, what's remarkable, and I didn't know that at that time, I was talking in the exactly the same room where Hans Frank has given his conference. Now, Hans Frank became the fourth man in my story. Even more remarkable, in 1945, Philippe and Henking started working on this famous trial, and they're back for the British, Lemkin for the Americans. Not that. He's focused on the crime against humanity. Lemkin focused on the genocide, protection of groups here. And the man who's targeting separately, because in fact the two never met each other, neither before or after the trial. What's remarkable is that the two men are targeting Hans Frank. But when the trial started, the 20th of November 1945, neither Lanterbat or Nemkin knew what had happened with their own families. And it's only in July and August 1946 that they found out that the man who sat not far from them, Hans Frank, was responsible for the death of their respective families. For somebody who pleads before international tribunals, it's remarkable to realize that a prosecutor can be personally involved in this kind of relations. And we return to Nuremberg. This second book is telling the story of the deputy of Hans Frank, Otto van Werchter, and his wife Charlotte, who was a great jurist. There are a lot of coincidences, and I think it's a reason why people love stories and narratives. There are amazing coincidences. Otto van Werchter started studying at the University of Vienna in October 1919, the very same day as Rasenbad, who moved from Nuremberg to Vienna and who studied with Hans Gelsen. And 25 years later, Wester participated to the extermination of Latterpatin's family and the family of my grandfather. So these points are absolutely remarkable. Now, on the contrary of Frank, who was arrested in Bavaria in May 1945, Wester got away, and in fact he escaped with the help of the same Archbishop who assisted Klaus Barbie. And there's a link there between this location and the second book. The second book tells the story of a man who wants to escape and go to Argentina. It's a very complex story, which totally was overbearing for me for different reasons. Because Wester was also accused of crimes against humanity and genocide, and he escaped for 4 years in the mountains in Austria. We got all the necessary documentation because his son gave his personal files here. And in 1949 he arrived in Rome in Italy, and he was helped by this Archbishop from Islam from Austria. And it's also a book that concerns justice, and probably even more so, the lack of justice or injustice, because in 1945 and 1949 major changes are taking place in the world. And the main change was that the Cold War had just started. And I started to discover documentation and material that clearly stated that the British and the Americans changed their position. This part of their services are looking for the Nazis. There's another part of their services and departments and state departments that are recruiting these same Nazis. It's amazing as a story. I was so amazed by what I discovered. I was flabbergasted. I went to talk, and I described this in my book. I went to talk with my neighbour. If you heard about the podcast in episode 6, it's my conversation with my neighbour, who's John Le Carré. And, he writes spy stories, and he said, yes, I was there in 1949. I lived at the time in Austria. I was a young British soldier at the time. And I was totally amazed, because I was told at the time that the Nazis, they were the worst of the worst you can imagine of mankind, and my job was to question them and interrogate them. But in fact, when I was interrogating them, I realized that the project in 1949-1950 wasn't at all to submit them and to hand them to justice, but to actually recruit them, because there was a new enemy, and the new enemy were the Bolsheviks, the communists, the Soviets. And he said, for a boy 18 years old, it was shocking to discover that we were recruiting these people, these ex-SS people who were murderers, and who murdered and assassinated in an industrial way. And the third way, which I'm currently writing, also concerns international justice. And here we're talking about Wester, the subject of my second book. Had a colleague, a very close colleague, whose name was Walter Raus. He's the person who invented, in 1941, Belzers, a little small truck with running on gas. He invented it, and with Wester, he escaped in 1945. But he was able to leave Europe at the time. Initially, he went to Syria, where he lived for a year. We've got a remarkable letter where he actually describes, he's writing to Vester, he said, don't come to Syria, it's not good for Germans to be in Syria. It'll be better for you to go to South Africa or South America. There are some rumours as well that Rauf, that's quite remarkable, was working for Israel during that period. He escaped. He first went to Quito in Ecuador, and in 1954 he's based there with his wife and his 2 children in Ecuador, and he met a Chilean soldier, a military person who's working in Ecuador and who is actually training the Ecuadorian army. He said, Ecuador isn't the right country for you, go to Chile, join me in Chile. And that man is Augusto Pinochet. Incredible, yeah, the links all over the place. He arrived in Chile in 1958, and 15 years later, Rauf started, apparently, working for Pinochet. After Pinochet took the power there. These are rumours, it hasn't been clearly established. Apparently he interrogated, he tortured in 1990 a young Chilean author, and the author said that he was personally tortured by Walter Rauf. And 8 years later, when Pinochet arrived in London, and he was arrested at the time. People forget he was arrested for reasons of crime against humanity. There is this witness of this young author, and I participated to the Pinochet trial in London. Crime against humanity. Walter Rauf, Vester, Hans Frank arrived in actually my chambers, and the story continues here. Now coming back to crime against humanity and genocide. When I started writing this book, and when I first visited Lviv in 2010 in Ukraine, I wasn't expecting what I was going to discover. I wasn't at all expecting to even write about it, and I was kind of surprised by the consequences of this book, which, as I mentioned, has been now translated in over 30 languages. I think this book had this kind of outcome, this kind of impact, because it concerns a subject which any human being understands. Difference between crime against humanity and genocide. This raises a fundamental question, an issue for all of us, and which we all understand. Who am I? Am I an individual, or am I a member of one or several groups? And in relation to that question, how do I want international law applied to me or protect me? Do I want international law to protect me just because I'm a human being, or do I want international law to protect me because I'm a member of a protected group? And that's the big discussion between Atterbuck and King in 1945. Atterbuck, his thesis, his idea is the protection. He shares the same goal and objective. He wants to protect human beings against these mass atrocities. But the way of reaching the goal isn't the same. For Atterbuck, we have to really focus on protecting any human being because they're individuals. Kim says no, that's not how it works. People are killed not because they did something, because they happen to be in a given moment members of a group that is detested in a geographic area. And to protect human beings, you have to protect groups. No, says Atterbuck, who's totally against the notion of a genocide. And he fears, and I think he's right, that a crime of genocide will end up replacing what Lauterbach called the tyranny of state by the tyranny of groups here. And I must say, having worked on many international cases that pertain to genocide, that the difference between crime against humanity, if you're killing 100,000 people, it will be a crime against humanity, but it's the genocide. Now in law, with the 1948 Convention, only a genocide is possible if we can establish an intent to actually destroy a whole group or part of a group. It's very difficult to prove because generally speaking the people who kill, mass kill, they don't leave pieces of paper saying, well, we're going to kill to exterminate a group of people. We have to prove this intent by other means, and it's extremely difficult to do so.
So, Lauterbach, who is against this whole idea of genocide, has said that Lemkin is going after genocides. Okay, human rights, protection of individuals, fine, but we do have to recognize groups as well. This is really the only way to protect humans. So there's this debate going on that began in 1945 and which continues today, in fact. And I came across a letter that Lemkin received. His book was published in 1944, and in the spring of 45, he received a letter from a friend, a refugee, who had gone to Wales. Said, I read your book. I'm very impressed. It's very interesting, but I fear that your chapter 9, entitled Genocide, is going to be very problematic. Why? Because you are using the law which goes in the same direction as Adolf Hitler. It's a biological idea of protection, and so if you follow that path, we will wind up at the same results. And so it's been 30 years now that I have been thinking about this intellectually, and I tend to agree with Lauterbach, but in the book there's a great deal of debate, in fact, and that's what I'm writing about. And I end the book by, when I was in Lviv, in Żukiew, which is nearby, there were 3,500 corpses found in a mass grave, including the entire family of my grandfather and Lauterbach's family as well. And so when I was in that place, and I went there just last week, the Ukrainian judge at the European Court of Human Rights had read my book, and he asked me to go with him because he wanted to see that place, to see if he had that same feeling. And so when you are standing before a mass grave where 3,500 people had been buried, including your own family, it is absolutely impossible to recognize Lemkin's ideas. So it's true that I'm really torn over this issue. But to finish with another coincidence, my first professor in international law at Cambridge in 1982 was Elie Lauterbach, the only son of Hirsch Lauterbach. And he was a very close colleague for 33 years with James Crawford. And in 2014, I discovered that my great grandmother was born in Żukiew on Limburger Strasse, and Hirsch Lauterbach was born there as well, same street. And the great writer Joseph Roth called East-West Street, and hence the title of the book. And I'll always remember the reaction from Elie Lauterpacht. We'd known each other for a long time. And they said, yeah, your father and my great-grandfather were born on the same street. It was absolutely amazing that we had found each other. So I know I've talked a bit too much, but I welcome any questions that you might have. I know that the first question is always the hardest. All right, well, I'll be the brave first person. After that, I'm sure there'll be more. Thank you so very much for your talk, combining family memories and legal concepts at the same time. I'd like to ask you, is there a risk around this concept of genocide? Is that it might be mixed in with other popular ideas, that it is the worst of crimes, that if we were going to classify them, that would be the top of the crime list. And so perhaps this is why I want people to pursue that. Well, then where is the limit? A group, it can be an entire people. It could be a village. I mean, where are the lines, in fact, in that concept? Well, now, according to Lemkin, the concept of genocide, it's not a question of numbers. In fact, according to Lemkin, if there's a village of 9 people and 3 different groups, A, B, C, and groups A and B decide to get rid of group C, which is only 3 people, that's a genocide. So for him, it's not about big numbers, but ever since the international courts have began to cover cases of genocides, it tends to be the large numbers. Now, in the ex-Yugoslavian criminal court, it was decided that 8,000 people in Srebrenica is a genocide. But what happened in Vukovar, 300 people, is not a genocide. And yet it's the same perpetrators, the same intent. So how can you explain that? And so this then creates a situation, as you just described, is that there's some sort of hierarchy of the crimes, at least in the popular perception of genocide. And yes, genocide is seen as being worse than war crimes, worse than crimes against humanity. Now, I don't agree with that perspective. They are all equally horrible. But in people's minds, they make this difference. And I have spoken with prosecutors. They have told me that when they talk with victims, victims don't want war crimes. They don't want crimes against humanity. They want a trial for genocide, because that is the only crime. And when an American president says there has been genocide, that was a genocide, that will be on the front page of the newspapers. This happened with President Biden, who mentioned the 1915 massacre of Armenians under the Ottoman Empire. And so there's a great deal of debate about what's going on in China. Is the treatment of the Uyghur peoples, is that a genocide? Okay, we don't have the facts around this, but it can no doubt be seen as a crime against humanity. So for me, I think there are 2, 3 reasons why we go for this ranking of genocide. I mean, genocide is an incredible word in itself, whereas crimes against humanity sounds legal and technical. It just doesn't evoke the same impressions or perceptions. Also, I think for many people, perhaps even including me, the idea of belonging to a group that is attacked simply because we are a member of that group is even worse than attacking people just as individual humans. So that's another thing. And then there's another thing. In 1948, a convention was signed on the punishing of genocide, whereas there was no convention on the punishment for crimes against humanity. So if we look at what happened with Bosnia, Gambia, the idea is we have to convince judges that there is genocide. But in fact, we don't have the equivalent type of guidelines for punishment for crimes against humanity. And so currently at the United Nations, well, not much is happening around this discussion because the member states who are pushing for this type of convention, United Kingdom and the United States, they are against it. Now, I'm not entirely sure why this is, but they are hostile to the idea. There's another project that I'm working on currently. There's an independent work group trying to give a new definition to international crimes. So we had war crimes in the 19th century, 1945. We had crimes against humanity and genocide and crimes of aggression. But since 1945, there's really been nothing. And so there's a gap there. All of these crimes are committed against humans, but there are no crimes against the environment. So there's a gap there. And so a lot of people, particularly young people, and under certain presidents, President Macron, the Pope, and others, are starting to talk about ecocide as being the 5th major crime. And so that's currently under debate. I would have preferred a different name, personally, because, as I explained, genocide, you have to prove intent to destroy, exterminate a group, whereas with ecocide, if we take the same line of thinking, very few people are out to destroy the environment. It's not their intent, but it's something else. It's because they're doing some other kind of activity that the environment suffers. So it's not the same. And so this is why I've told that working group that perhaps we should talk about crimes against humanity that are impacting the environment. They said, no, we've done the market research all over the world, and we've done tests. And we've seen that if we talk about crimes against humanity by impacting the environment, people say, well, what's that? What on earth is that? Never heard of it. But if we say ecocide, everyone knows, everyone understands it. Oh yeah, that's horrible. We have to do something about it. So words count. It's true. So I think that explains also why the word genocide is so important to us. So we have someone who's going to ask a question who's very familiar with the international courts. Well, we met with Philippe Sands at the Gaddafi trials because I was a lawyer, and I want to thank you for that presentation. So I would like to know if you consider slavery a crime against humanity, and is systematic slavery is an act of negating the humanity of the persons exploiting. Can this enter into the definition of genocide, even partially? What do you think? That is an enormous question, and I think it would take me about 4 hours to provide an answer. So how can we decide, how can we define slavery and what went on under slavery, which technically ended in 150 years ago, but whose effects have not entirely come to an end. And we know that there are other forms of slavery that continue as well. And so the consequences of the height of slavery in the European colonies, we know that the effects are still with us. I believe that that question should be framed, should be set in a time frame. I think that people don't realize that the concept of crimes against humanity and genocide are very recent concepts, in fact. They did not exist before 1945. I have become friends with the son of Hans Frank. He's a German journalist. He's a remarkable man. And sometimes we like to imagine what would have been the reaction of his father, in November 1945, when he's at Nuremberg, to be indicted for two crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity, that didn't exist in 33, 39, 42, 43, and that were invented in the summer of 45 and then applied retroactively. So that's the reality. These were notions, these concepts were invented in 45. So we've just been through an extraordinary moment. We're still living it. I mentioned President Biden, who pronounced the word genocide when speaking of what happened, what was done to the Armenians in 1915. Of course, Turkey was not happy with this. And they said, well, the Turks say, well, genocide didn't exist as a concept in 1915, so we can't speak of genocide. We can't apply it to what happened in 1915. But there's an even more recent example that opens some very interesting doors between Germany and Namibia on what happened in 1908 and the way the Germans treated the Herero people. Because Germany recognized that what happened in 1908 was a genocide and has offered about 1 billion euros as a form of compensation to Namibia. So this is particularly interesting because this opens the door to a wider discussion and a deeper discussion around the question of reparations and recognition, anyway, for what happened in the 18th and 19th centuries against the United Kingdom, and in the Caribbean, what was happened in the Caribbean and Africa. I participated in a conference organized by Judge Patrick Robinson at the International Court of Justice as a Jamaican who is very much interested in this question. And we were wondering, can we imagine now, when we look at the consequences of slavery of the 19th century, can we imagine reparations? And so we began our discussion more around crimes against humanity, but I believe that we could also argue that the treatment of these enslaved peoples could also be qualified as a genocide. If the treatment of the Herero people is allowed as a genocide, recognized as genocide, then why not slavery? So currently, we're in a period where things are not clear, which ties into another issue that we see in the papers today, and that is a repatriation of works of art to Benin, whose art objects are found in museums around the world. And in The Guardian this morning, for the very first time, we have seen, I think it was, I don't know if it was Oxford or Cambridge, who have art objects and who have agreed to return these objects to Benin. So little by little, that door is opening as well. So the countries that are the most nervous about this, of course, are the former colonial powers, of course, because they are the ones who will be targeted by such efforts. I myself am involved in a case. I'm advising Mauritius Island against the United Kingdom in a case there concerning the treatment of the population of an archipelago known as Chagos. So the Chagos archipelago was part of the colony of Mauritius, but in 1965, the British separated that archipelago, so it became just a small separate island, and they gave one of those islands to the United States. It's at Diego Garcia, which is an American military base. So between 68 and 73, they removed the entire population, over 2,000 people, and sent them to the Seychelles, Mauritius Island, and to the United Kingdom as well. And Article 7 in the International Court statutes is very clear on this point. A deportation of a population, depriving them of rights, is considered a crime against humanity. And so in 2019, the International Court of Justice said that the separation of the Chagos Island was contrary to international law and is therefore nullified, and it belongs to Mauritius Island. And that the results of that decision open the door now as well to arguing that what happened between 68 and 73, and which continues to have effects today, given Great Britain's refusal to allow the people to return home, is a crime against humanity. So your question is absolutely key. It's a question of the timing as well. So it is international law, and particularly international criminal law. Can it now make rulings on historic acts which continue to have effects today? So that's a major question that is really not easy to resolve.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Sorry, we need a mic. Yes, we are already 10 minutes late. We're not going to be able to take any further questions a bit later on. Philippe Zons with Xavier Jean Kita will be talking about an international justice. That will be at 5 minutes past 2. We're now going to have lunch, and we've got until 1:30 p.m.
There's no point in me handing over. I wasn't sure who was on. I just gonna go on.
Yeah, well, that's
He's
Murphy's Law. That was good.